These are a couple of example rations. So grazing very poor feed or bare paddocks. There's a bit of a disclosure statement. Adjust the rations for larger frame sheep, rams, cold weather, etc. Or basically anything else that could negatively impact their maintenance requirements. So to contain the sheep at condition score 2, 49 megajoules a week. What's that look like in real terms? What's that look like on the farm? Here they're suggesting 3.8 kilos of wheat, half a kilo of straw, and if you're going down the table, which I would challenge this, probably shouldn't really use the slide if I'm going to challenge it, I would challenge this on 5.8 kilos of cereal hay, because the issue of cereal hay is the cereal hay I buy would be completely different to the cereal hay that you could buy. And what is that 3-letter thing you need to remember when you're looking at cereal hay or any hay or forages? NDF. And that's going to determine how much they can physically eat of that. So you might buy cereal hay that's absolutely excellent and no dramas, they can eat 5.8 kilos. But you might buy some cereal hay that was made in 2016 when it was standing this high, and they'll only be able to eat half a kilo of it, which is in relation to that table prior. Even though the nutrient density looks good and the ME test and the protein test looks good on the feed test, if the NDF's high, it's going to restrict their intake. So it's irrelevant how good the energy density, how good the energy and the protein test is on that feed if the NDF's too high. So these don't account for any wastage, these figures, and I'm pretty sure they're just on a as-fed, no, they're on a dry matter basis. So this part's on an as-fed basis, this part's on a dry matter basis. So condition score 3, 60 kilos. This is what I'd really like to want you to target. 4.5 kilos of wheat. This is full hand feeding. So this isn't, you've got no paddock feed. So don't be alarmed by that. This is if we're in absolute dire straits, absolutely no paddock feed. They're in the feedlot. People comfortable with those numbers? Is that familiar, or is that a bit high, or?
It's a fair bit of weight. 4.5 kilos of weight is a fair bit of weight for one sheep.
So I also think it's a fair bit of weight, and this number here is probably a bit too low for me. We probably want about 10% crude fibre in the overall diet, but generally speaking, you're not going to go out there and allocate 10% crude fibre in the diet. You're going to go out there and either put a bale of straw in whenever it runs out, or a bale of cereal hay in every 4 days, or a bale of cereal hay on Friday so you don't have to feed in the weekend, so you feed Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, whatever. But so if you're generally going to find that if you're putting a bale of straw in, even though straw is a very low nutrient quality, they'll probably get a little bit out of it, and you'd adjust your figures. And what I've found most this year, we've managed to hold sheep at condition score 2 at about 3.5 kilos a week with just straw. And if you want them to put some on, we've had to go up to the 4 and 4 and a bit, or just the lower the condition score, the more health problems you have in the feedlot as well, or your containment area. So if you can hold them in a bit better condition, it reduces your health issues. So animals that were fed 4.5 kilos did a lot better. Yes, it's a lot of wheat. In that instance, we had the opportunity to shandy it with corn. So we used a couple of kilos of corn, 3 kilos of wheat and 2 kilos of corn. That was basically the mix. Because it reduces the starch. Corn's a nice slow fermenting starch, very safe feed. Also great for heavily pregnant ewes. So it reduces that fermentation rate and reduces your acidosis risk. So it's a great feed as well. But it's kind of like Tim Tams at the moment. It's a luxury item from now on. So, and the reality is, has anyone thought about trying to procure barley to feed their sheep from now through to the autumn?
I think there's plenty do that. There's plenty do that.
Yeah, but have you thought about buying it yet?
No.
Well, you're saying it's going to be scarce.
It will be hard to come by, so you're probably more in a season like this, and you might be okay for this area, but more in a season like this, you have to be comfortable with being able to feed some of these other feeds if you're going to choose to feed sheep to meet their energy requirements. You can probably get away with feeding alternate feedstuffs, but you mightn't meet their energy requirements. So we're probably not going to be able. You can access barley, but it's as dear as wheat. It's probably even a bit dearer in certain spots. So I've had plenty of guys that are comfortable with feeding because we've had plenty of practice at it. Some people have been feeding since September last year. So, and they're feeding wheat now, and they're going to feed wheat all summer. Just because it's going to, for the energy density, which you see here, 4.6 kilos of wheat is the equivalent to 5 kilos of barley. So for the energy density, you get more bang for your buck out of your wheat, and at the same price, it's going to be cheaper to feed your wheat. But you've got to be comfortable feeding it. So that's something you need to keep in mind as well.
Are they feeding it in trods or on the ground?
Both. So this one, the one example I'll use is where we shandied it. We had it in close feeders, the big close feeders. They were 6-ton feeders, and there was also ewes out in the paddock. And they lambed in 100. They had 1,500 ewes in a 100-acre paddock, and they lambed in there. They had absolutely nowhere else for these sheep to go, and they set up a nursery with straw bales in different spots of the paddock, and they marked somewhere between 55 and 60% of lambs in those ewes. And it was the best out of a bad situation. So yeah, they were fed on the ground, and they were fed in feeders as well. And we had absolutely nowhere else for them to go. And they were determined to hang on to their ewes because their view is that when the rain occurs with the low flock numbers and the energy and effort that they've put into their breeding flock, that they're not going to be able to replace them. And they were comfortable spending that $120 a ewe. At the time we did the feed budget and it was under 100. Now it's up to about 140. But they were comfortable spending that. So your feed budget rules of thumb. Calculate your requirements on a dry matter basis, then convert to as fed. You've probably got a lot more access to grain still over here, but further west, seeing a lot of people use alternative feed sources. So grape marc, almond hulls, orange pulp, even here potentially a bit of cottonseed meal. All those things vary in dry matter content, and you need to convert everything back to a dry matter content so that you can have a level playing field when you're doing your costs. When you're doing your cost of feed, you need to convert it back. And I think there's the dry matter content rules roughly in the back of that book as well. But they're pretty easy to find. Minimum 10% crude fibre in the diet. So we always want to have a bit of straw or hay on access to the sheep. Mature sheep, 6 to 8% protein in the diet. We can get away with that. Generally speaking, we'd like to see it 8 plus. 6 to 8 megajoules depending on the size of the animal and depending on its status. Weaners, 14 to 16% protein. We want that to be true protein, so we don't want to use, we want to absolutely minimise the use of non-protein nitrogen such as urea, and be careful of that when you're looking at different feedstuffs. 10 megajoules of energy per head per day, and this is looking at feed tests. Will the NDF decrease my dry matter intake? That is, generally speaking, one of the biggest determinants of gut fill in sheep. The biggest limiting factor, I should say, and it determines your gut fill. So, as I alluded to, the customer I was working with that was happy spending $100 a head per sheep, you've got to be realistic about your budgets. So if we do decide to procure barley, it's going to be $450 a tonne. Might be cheaper at harvest, might come down to $400. We need to sit there and work through, righto, how many cents a kilo is that? How many kilos do we need to feed a week? And I always do my feed budgets on a per head basis and then work it out from there. And it's easy to multiply out. Always make sure you understand the class of animal that you're trying to feed first. There's no point trying to feed cereal hay to a weaner to get it through because it just won't grow. And it's just not going to meet its energy requirement. And even though you've spent the money on it, it's not going to have a huge amount of value to you. An animal that's struggled through gestation and also struggled through the early stages of its life and as a young animal will never be as good or an efficient animal as an animal that's been supplied the right amount of nutrients through that pregnancy period and then through its early stages of development. So, and you'll see that with sheep that are born in a drought year never grow as big as sheep that are born in a good season. And they've got exactly the same genetic potential, but they were just starved of the nutrient requirements at the critical periods. So we need to make sure the nutrient requirements for those animals are met, provide a ration that meets your production objectives. Are we going to feed our weaners? Are we going to feed our ewes? Are we going to be feeding pregnant twin ewes? Are we going to be feeding pregnant single ewes? What are we feeding? Seasonality, identify your limiting nutrients. So as I've already mentioned a couple of times, make sure that you understand what the limiting nutrient is going to be. In spring and summer, first of all in spring, it becomes fibre. Then after you get rains, it becomes fibre and protein and energy. And so that's the point where we need to start thinking, even though I've got that body of dry feed there, I'm going to have to put something with it to make the animal be able to utilise it. Because your dry feed is a great natural straw source or a natural fibre source, but you just got to put something with it. And you would know, you put sheep into a paddock of dry feed, they hardly touch it. You know, they find all the green pick underneath it and they just walk it into the ground. You put sheep into a paddock of dry feed and supplement them with 200 or 300 grams of grain a day, just as a maintenance requirement through the back end of spring or into summer, they'll eat that paddock to the ground. Has anyone ever noticed that? They'll eat the grass to the ground. And it's got a role to play. So everything's got a role to play. And make sure that if we're going to supply the limiting nutrients, we need to balance the ration. So we'll stay on fibre. Fibre is the limiting nutrient because there's too much of it in the spring. Fibre can also be the limiting nutrient in the autumn on, say, an irrigated pasture because there's not enough of it. The feed's too digestible. So it works both ways. So keep that in your mind.